The first thing I heard when I stepped onto the training floor was laughter. Not the friendly kind. The kind that comes from a crowd that already knows how the story ends. 6 cadets stood in a loose circle around me, each one taller than the last, each one built from a different corner of the galaxy. Scales, plates, fur, and one creature made almost entirely of jointed metal-colored bone. I was the only human in the room, and by the way they looked at me, I was also the only thing in the room they found funny. "Careful," said a voice from the back, deep and rasping. "It might bite." More laughter. I kept my face still, and my hands loose at my sides, the way I had been trained to stand when people wanted me to react, and I refused to give them what they wanted. My name is Mira Solano. 3 weeks earlier, I had been standing on a launch platform on Earth, watching my homeworld shrink into a blue dot behind the window of a transport ship. I was 19 years old, and I was about to become the first human ever accepted into the Concordat Officer Academy, a training ground built by alliance of a dozen alien species who had been flying between stars since before humans learned to make fire. They did not want me there. They made that clear before I even unpacked my bags. The academy sat on a ring-shaped station, orbiting a gas giant with 2 moons, a place built for beings twice my height and 3 times my strength. The halls were tall enough for creatures with wings to fly through them. The chairs in the mess hall were shaped for bodies with extra joints. Everything about the place reminded me, every single hour, that I did not belong. "Cadet Solano," the instructor's voice snapped through the room, cutting the laughter short. His name was Griv, a broad-shouldered alien from a warrior species called the Doran, with skin like cracked stone and eyes that never seemed to blink. He looked at me the way a butcher looks at meat that has not decided yet whether it wants to be eaten. "You are late," he said, though I was not. "I was told to report at 0900, sir," I said. "It is 0900. "Then you are late by 19 years, he said, and the room laughed again. "Humans do not belong in this program. You were let in because the Concordat Council wanted to look kind. I do not care about kindness. I care about cadets who can survive a fight. You will not survive long here." I said nothing. I had already learned, in 3 short weeks, that silence made better armor than words. Griv turned toward a data screen mounted on the wall and pulled up a training bracket, a list of names sorted for the week's sparring rotation. He tapped a name near the bottom of the list, in a section marked for cadets who were expected to wash out before the semester ended. "You are assigned to remedial combat," he said. "It is where cadets who cannot fight go to learn they cannot fight." A cadet near the front, tall and blue-skinned with a ridge of spines running down his neck, stepped forward. His name badge read Threxil, and beneath his species designation it listed Kathrani, a warrior caste known across a dozen systems for producing some of the deadliest close combat fighters the galaxy had ever trained. "I request the honor of testing the human," Threxil said, his voice smooth and certain, like a person placing a bet he had already won. Griv considered this for a long moment, and something like amusement crossed his stone-colored face. "Very well," he said. "The proving bout will be held this evening. Cadet Threxil against Cadet Solano. All classes are invited to observe." The room erupted into whispers. I heard the words easy, quick, and embarrassment passed between the other cadets, like a joke everyone already understood except me. I did not understand it yet either, not fully. But I understood enough to know that Threxil was not being given to me as a fair test. He was being given to me as a lesson, one meant to remind every non-human in this academy exactly where humanity belonged in the order of things. After the room emptied, I stayed behind for a moment, staring at the practice floor, at the scuff marks left behind by heavier bodies and older winds. My hands were shaking, just slightly, and I pressed them flat against my legs until they stopped. Back on Earth, before any of this, I had spent 4 years training in a discipline my grandmother used to call the old art, a mix of grappling and joint control that soldiers had used for generations, refined long before starships existed. It was not flashy. It was not built for size or strength. It was built for something smaller and sharper: timing. My grandmother used to say that the biggest fighter in the room only wins if the fight goes the way he expects it to. I thought about that as I walked back to my quarters, through halls too tall for me, past cadets who stared like I was a curiosity rather than a colleague. I thought about it while I sat alone at dinner, while conversations near me quieted the moment I passed, the way rooms sometimes go still around something they don't understand. By the time evening came, word of the proving bout had traveled through the entire academy. I could feel it in the air the moment I stepped toward the arena, a large domed chamber built for exactly these kinds of exhibitions. Every seat was full. Cadets from other years, instructors, even a few visiting officials from other Concordat worlds had come to watch. They had not come to see a fight. They had come to see a joke. I stood at the edge of the sparring floor and looked across the wide circular space, now stripped of any of its floor plating and technology, at Threxil, who was stretching his long limbs with the easy confidence of someone who had already imagined how this would end. His species had a reputation for speed that rivaled and often beat the strength of far larger beings. He was not just fast, he was fast and he knew it, and that made him dangerous. Griv stood at the center of the floor, addressing the crowd in a booming voice that echoed off the domed ceiling. "This is a standard proving bout," he announced. "First cadet to yield, or first cadet unable to continue, loses. No weapons, no modifications, only skill." The crowd cheered, and beneath the cheer, I heard someone near the front row mutter a word, in a language I did not know, but understood anyway, from tone alone. It meant something close to pitiful. Threxil looked at me across the floor, and for just a moment, something flickered behind his confident expression. Not fear, not yet, just the faint, distant curiosity of a predator, noticing something small, move in a way it did not expect. "Do not worry, human," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "I will make this quick." I stepped onto the floor and rolled my shoulders, letting the tension settle into something useful instead of something that would slow me down. "Good," I said. "So will I." The crowd laughed again, louder this time, delighted by what they assumed was empty bravado from a creature too small and too soft to understand the size of the mistake she was making. Griv raised his arm between us, waiting for the signal that would start the match, and in that final second before the fight began, the noise of the crowd faded into something distant and unimportant. All that remained was the floor beneath my feet, the space between me and Threxil, and 4 years of training that no one in this room had bothered to ask me about. Griv's arm dropped, and the crowd that had come expecting a joke was about to learn they were watching something else entirely. Threxil moved first, the way I had expected him to. His species relied on speed, and speed rewards confidence. He crossed the distance between us in a single long stride, one arm sweeping out in a wide, sure motion meant to end things immediately, meant to prove exactly what everyone in that room already believed about the gap between us. I did not step back. That was the part he had not prepared for. Every instinct in a room full of taller, stronger beings told them that a smaller opponent should retreat, should create distance, should try to survive by staying out of reach. My grandmother had taught me the opposite. Distance is what lets a bigger fighter use his size. Distance is where he is dangerous. The only place he is not dangerous is close enough that his size becomes a burden instead of a weapon. So instead of stepping back, I stepped in. I caught his outstretched arm just above the wrist, turned my hip into the motion, and used his own forward momentum to carry him past me instead of into me. It was not a technique built on strength. It was built on timing, on reading the exact moment his balance shifted from stable to committed, and acting inside that half second before his body could correct itself. His feet left the ground for less than a heartbeat. By the time his shoulder touched the floor, my other hand had already found his wrist and turned it against the joint, locking his arm in a position his body was never built to escape from strength alone. It did not matter how fast he was. It did not matter how strong his species had been bred to be, over 1,000 generations of warrior culture. In that position, strength worked against him instead of for him. The harder he pulled, the more the lock tightened. The entire exchange took 3 seconds. I know this because Griv checked the recording twice afterward, certain the equipment had made an error. Threxil's free hand slapped the floor once, twice, the universal signal of surrender taught in every fighting discipline across every species in the Concordat. I released the lock immediately and stepped back, my breathing steady, my heart pounding not from exertion but from the sheer silence that had swallowed the arena whole. No one clapped, no one spoke. Hundreds of beings from a dozen worlds sat frozen in their seats, staring at the floor, as though the scene in front of them refused to make sense, no matter how many times they replayed it in their minds. Threxel rose slowly, cradling his arm, his expression somewhere between confusion and something I would only later understand was the beginning of respect. He looked at me for a long moment, and then, without a word, gave a short, formal bow, the kind reserved for opponents, a warrior considered worth remembering. Griv walked to the center of the floor, his stone-colored face unreadable. He glanced at the timer on the display screen above the arena, then glanced at me, then back at the screen, as though hoping the numbers would change if he looked at them long enough. "Match," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "Winner, Cadet Solano." The silence broke into noise all at once, but it was not the noise I expected. It was not cheering. It was the low murmur of 100 private conversations happening at the same time, cadets leaning toward each other, whispering questions no one had answers to yet. I caught fragments of it as I walked off the floor. How did she do that? That is not possible. Did you see how fast? Humans are not supposed to move like that. I did not smile. I did not celebrate. I had learned enough in 3 weeks to know that a victory like this one would not earn me friends. If anything, it had just made me more of a mystery, and mysteries made people uneasy in ways that plain mockery never had. I was right. By the time I reached the mess hall an hour later, the story of the match had already spread through the entire station, growing new details with every telling. I overheard 2 cadets from a species with 4 arms discussing it near the food dispensers, and in their version, I had moved before Threxel even raised his hand. Another group near the far wall insisted I must have used some kind of illegal enhancement, because no unmodified body, especially not a human body, could move with that kind of precision. I sat alone at a table near the back, as I had every meal since arriving, and ate in silence, while the whispers moved around me, like a current I could not swim against. "You broke something." I looked up. A cadet I did not recognize stood across the table, a small being from a species called the Fenrir, with large dark eyes and a thin, wiry frame closer to my own size than most of the beings I had met at the academy. Her name badge read Ivy Sanders, which surprised me, since most cadets kept their species' original names. "I did not break anything," I said carefully. "It was a joint lock. He tapped out before there was any damage." "Not his arm," she said, sliding into the seat across from me without asking. "I mean, you broke something bigger. Everyone here grew up believing certain things about how a fight is supposed to look. Big wins over small, strong wins over fast. You just proved that belief wrong in front of the entire officer corps, on your first week, against a Kathrani warrior caste fighter no less." "I did not do it to prove anything," I said. "I did it because he attacked me, and I did not want to lose." Ivy studied me for a long moment. That particular expression, I would learn over the following weeks, was one she wore whenever she was deciding whether someone was worth trusting. "They already have a name for you," she said. "I heard it twice on the way here." "What name?" "Shadowfang." I frowned. "That is not my name." "It is now," Ivy said, almost gently. "Around here, names are not chosen. They are given, usually by the people who fear you the most, and usually before they understand you at all." I did not know, in that moment, whether to be insulted or unsettled. The name sounded almost like an accusation, as though speed and precision made me something closer to a predator than a soldier. I thought about telling her that a 3-second match did not make me dangerous, that it made me lucky, that Threxel had simply underestimated an opponent he assumed could not fight back. But even as I thought it, some quieter part of me knew that was not entirely true. I had not been lucky. I had trained for years to read exactly the kind of overconfidence Threxel had shown me, to turn size and strength into weaknesses rather than advantages. Luck did not explain the years of drills, the thousands of repetitions, the countless times I had been thrown to a mat by instructors twice my size, until my body learned, without needing to think, exactly where an opponent's balance would break. What unsettled me was not the fight. It was what came after it. Griv found me later that night, standing near a viewport that looked out over the gas giant below, its swirling storms lit orange and violet by a distant sun. He did not say anything for a while, simply stood beside me, arms crossed, watching the same view. "In 30 years of teaching at this academy," he said finally, I have trained warriors from 11 different worlds. I have seen fighters twice your size fail to do what you did tonight. I am not trying to be a warrior, sir, I said. I am trying to earn my place here. You misunderstand, Griv said. I did not say this as a compliment. I said it as a warning. What you did on that floor tonight will not be forgotten by morning. Some will admire it, more will fear it. And fear, Cadet, is far more dangerous to you than any opponent you will face in an arena. I looked at him, waiting for him to explain further, but he only shook his head slowly, the closest thing to concern I had seen on his stone-colored face since I had arrived. Sleep while you can, he said, turning to leave. Tomorrow, every cadet who watched that match will want to know if it was real. And the only way they will be satisfied is if they see it happen again. I stood alone at the viewport long after he left, watching the storms churn silently below, and for the first time since stepping off the transport ship 3 weeks earlier, I understood that winning a single fight had not solved my problem. It had only made a much bigger one. I woke before dawn to the sound of my door chime, sharp and insistent, 3 quick pulses that meant official business rather than a friendly visit. I opened it to find 2 academy officers waiting in the corridor, tall beings in gray uniforms I recognized as belonging to the Concordat's Internal Review Division, the department responsible for making sure cadets followed every rule written into the Academy's charter. Cadet Solano, the taller one said, her voice flat and formal, you are requested for a medical and technical scan. Immediately. May I ask why? I said, though I already suspected the answer. Concerns have been raised regarding the outcome of last night's proving bout, she said. The review board wishes to confirm that no unauthorized enhancements were used. I did not argue. I had expected something like this the moment Ivy told me the whispers had already turned to accusations. I followed the officers through corridors still mostly empty at this hour, past cadets from the night shift, trudging back to their quarters, several of whom stopped and stared as I passed, the same way people stare at something they have heard about but never seen for themselves. The scan took almost 2 hours. They checked my blood, my bone density, my neural response times, searching for any trace of the kind of illegal augmentation sometimes smuggled onto academy grounds by cadets desperate to gain an edge. I sat still through all of it, answering questions calmly, though beneath my calm exterior, a small, cold worry had begun to settle in. Not because I feared what they would find. I feared what it would mean if they found nothing at all, because nothing would mean the only explanation left was the one nobody in that academy wanted to accept, that I had simply been better. By mid-morning, I was called before a review panel in a chamber I had never entered before, a circular room with high windows and seats arranged around a central floor, the kind of place clearly built for hearings rather than lessons. 3 overseers sat behind a long curved desk, each one representing a different member species of the Concordat Council. I recognized one of them immediately, a silver-scaled being named Overseer Van, whose image I had seen in the Academy's welcome materials weeks earlier, back when the idea of humans joining this program had still felt like an honor rather than a burden. Cadet Solano, Overseer Van said, her voice measured and careful. The scans confirm no unauthorized modifications were present in your physiology. Your victory last night appears to have been achieved through unmodified skill alone. Thank you, I said, though something in her tone told me the hearing was not over. That is, in some ways, a more difficult outcome for this council to explain, she continued. Cadet Threxil is among the top combat performers in his class. His species has produced champions across a dozen Concordat tournaments. For a first-year human cadet, with no prior officer training, to defeat him in under 4 seconds raises questions this council did not expect to be asking during your first month here. I am happy to answer any questions you have, I said. One of the other overseers, a broad, insect-like being, with layered plating along his arms, leaned forward. Explain your technique, he said, not unkindly, but with the sharp focus of someone genuinely trying to understand something outside his experience. Our combat training emphasizes strength, endurance, and honor-based engagement. What you demonstrated resembled none of that. I thought carefully before answering, aware that whatever I said in this room would likely be repeated across the entire academy before nightfall. On my homeworld, I said, humans have spent thousands of years fighting without the kind of natural weapons many Concordat species were born with. No claws, no natural armor, no enhanced strength. We survived because we learned to use an opponent's own strength and momentum against them, rather than trying to match it directly. It is not about being stronger. It is about controlling the moment where an opponent commits to an attack, and using that commitment before they can recover from it. And the speed, the insect-like overseer said. Our sensors recorded your reaction time as faster than 90% of cadets currently enrolled, despite your species being physically unremarkable by most Concordat standards. I hesitated, unsure how to explain something that had never needed explaining before, not to anyone who had grown up on a world without natural predators large enough to hunt something the size of a person. Humans evolved with predators, I said finally. For most of our history, if we were not fast enough, or aware enough, or willing to fight back the instant we sensed danger, we did not survive to have children. I think many Concordat species evolved without that pressure. You built armor, or claws, or size, and those things protected you from most threats before your reflexes needed to develop the same way ours did. We did not have that safety. We had to be quick, or we did not get a second chance. The chamber went quiet. Overseer Van exchanged a brief glance with her colleagues, something unreadable passing between them. That is a troubling thought, she said eventually. For centuries, this council has evaluated species readiness for advanced roles, based on strength, size, and technological development. It has never fully accounted for the possibility that a species without natural advantages might develop a different kind of readiness altogether, one built entirely around necessity. I did not come here to threaten anyone, I said. I came here because I wanted a chance to serve, the same as any other cadet. Perhaps, said the insect-like overseer quietly, but intentions rarely change how quickly others begin to see you differently, Cadet. And after last night, they already have. The hearing ended without any formal punishment, which I later learned was itself unusual. Cases involving suspected combat irregularities normally took days to resolve. Mine had ended within a single morning, the moment the scans confirmed there was nothing left to investigate, except the uncomfortable truth that I had simply outfought my opponent. Word of the hearing spread almost as quickly as word of the match itself. By the time I returned to the training halls that afternoon, the whispers had changed shape entirely. The accusations of cheating had faded, replaced by something quieter, and in some ways more unsettling, a kind of careful, deliberate distance. Cadets who had laughed at me during my first weeks now watched me from across rooms, without speaking, studying me the way you might study a locked door you were not sure you wanted to open. Ivy found me near the training hall entrance, arms crossed, an expression on her face somewhere between amusement and concern. You survived the review, she said. Barely felt like surviving, I said. Felt more like being taken apart and put back together in front of an audience. That is basically what it was, she said. The council does not like surprises. And you, Mira Solano, are the biggest surprise this academy has had in a decade. We began walking together toward the mess hall, and along the way, I noticed something new. Cadets stepped slightly aside as we passed, not out of hostility exactly, but out of a kind of instinctive caution, the same caution creatures show around something they have not yet decided is safe to stand near. They are calling you Shadow Fang in 3 different languages now, Ivy said. I heard a Doran cadet use it this morning like it was already your official designation. I never agreed to that name, I said. Nobody agrees to names like that, Ivy said. They just happen, usually the moment enough people decide the old way of describing you no longer fits. That evening, as I sat in the mostly empty training hall practicing basic footwork alone, Threxil entered through the far door. I straightened instinctively, unsure what to expect, given the way our first meeting had ended. He walked toward me slowly, his injured arm now healed and wrapped in a light support brace, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. I have replayed the recording 11 times, he said finally. I am sorry about your arm, I said. Do not be, he said, something almost like respect in his voice. Among my people, losing a match cleanly, without dishonor, without excuses, is not shameful. It is instructive. I have spent 30 years training under warriors twice my size, believing size and speed together were the highest form of combat readiness. You proved there is a third element I had never properly trained for. What element? I asked. Patience, he said. You did not fight me the way I expected. You waited for me to make the first mistake. And then you used it before I even understood I had made it. I considered his words carefully, surprised by how closely they matched what I had tried to explain to the overseers earlier that day. On my homeworld, I said, we have an old saying, the bigger fighter only wins if the fight goes the way he expects it to. Threxel studied me for a long moment, then gave a short, respectful nod, the same gesture he had offered at the end of our match the night before. Then I hope, Shadowfang, he said, testing the name carefully, as though trying it on for the first time, that the next opponent who faces you understands that lesson before it is too late for them. He left without another word, and I stood alone in the quiet training hall, staring at the empty floor where, less than a day earlier, a 3-second exchange had rewritten how an entire academy understood the smallest cadet in its history. I did not yet know it, but the name had already spread far beyond the training halls and mess hall corridors. By the following morning, it would reach instructors in departments I had never even visited, cadets in years above mine who had never seen a human up close, and eventually, officials far beyond the academy itself, in offices where decisions about humanity's place among the stars were made by beings who had never once considered that the newest, smallest species in the Concordat might be the one they understood the least. The fight had lasted 3 seconds. The name would last far longer. Over the following 2 weeks, I stopped counting how many times I heard someone ask to test the human. The phrase followed me from the training halls to the mess hall to the narrow corridors between dormitory blocks, spoken sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with challenge, and occasionally with something closer to open hostility. Griv, to his credit, did not shield me from any of it. If anything, he seemed to view the growing line of challengers as a kind of ongoing exam, one designed to answer a single question that the entire academy now seemed desperate to settle. Was the match against Threxel a fluke, or was it the beginning of something the Concordat had never properly measured before? I lost my second match, 3 days after the hearing, against a cadet named Korath, from a species built for grappling, with 4 arms and a body dense enough to absorb blows that would have ended a human fight in a single strike. I had misjudged the reach of his second set of arms, focusing too much on the first pair, and by the time I corrected my footing, he had already closed the distance and pinned me against the mat, with more limbs than I had learned to track. I tapped out without hesitation, no shame in the loss, only the sharp, useful sting of a lesson learned. Afterward, Korath offered me a hand up, and unlike some of the earlier whispers I had grown used to, his expression held nothing but simple respect. You adjust quickly, he said. Most cadets who lose their first match against 4 arms never account for it correctly in the second attempt. There will not be a second attempt today, I said, catching my breath, but there will be one eventually. He laughed, a low rumbling sound I had not expected from a being built like a wall. I look forward to it, Shadowfang. The name had settled into something almost normal by then, spoken without malice by most of the cadets who used it, though I still had not decided whether I liked it. It followed me into a third match, which I won, and a fourth, which I lost, and by the end of the second week, a strange kind of respect had begun forming around me, not the easy respect given to someone liked, but the wary, careful respect given to someone unpredictable. It was during the third week that everything shifted again, in a way none of the matches before it had prepared me for. I noticed her before I knew her name, a small cadet from a quiet, scholarly species called the Yeshka, thin-limbed and soft-spoken, assigned to remedial combat training the same way I had been on my first day. Her name was Nora, and unlike most cadets at the academy, she had not come from a warrior culture or a military background. Her species specialized in engineering and diplomacy, and she had been placed into basic combat training only because Concordat regulations required every officer cadet, regardless of species specialty, to complete a minimum level of physical readiness. She was, by every measure the academy used, hopeless at it, slow, hesitant, unwilling to commit fully to strikes even during supervised drills. I had watched her struggle through footwork exercises twice now, and both times, I had seen the same look on her face that I imagined I must have worn during my own first days here. Not fear of losing, fear of not belonging. The trouble began when a senior cadet named Varn, a large, heavily built warrior from a species known for its brutal training culture, requested a supervised sparring session against Nora, framed officially as remedial practice. I happened to be near the training hall entrance when I overheard two instructors discussing it quietly, their voices low with concern. Neither of them seemed willing to voice directly to Griv. Varn requested her specifically, one of them said, 3rd time this month. The last 2 remedial cadets he trained against ended their sessions in the medical bay. The reports called them training accidents, the other said. They were not accidents, the first replied, glancing toward the training hall doors. He is testing how far he can push weaker cadets before instructors intervene, and so far, nobody has stopped him. I did not wait to hear more. I found Griv in his office and explained what I had overheard, watching his expression harden as I spoke. He confirmed, reluctantly, that similar incidents had occurred before, technically within the rules of supervised sparring, but clearly designed by Varn to intimidate weaker cadets under the guise of official training. The regulations allow supervised remedial matches to continue until one participant is unable to proceed, Griv said. As long as Varn does not cross that line directly, there are no formal grounds to stop the session. Then let me take her place, I said. Griv studied me carefully. That is not how remedial assignments work, Cadet. Reassign the match, I said. Varn wants to test how far he can push a weaker opponent. Let him test it against someone who will not need protecting. It took convincing, but eventually Griv agreed, citing academy precedent that allowed voluntary substitution in supervised matches under specific safety conditions. By the time I stepped onto the training floor that afternoon, Nora was nowhere near it, moved instead to a separate observation area at my quiet insistence, and Varn stood waiting across from me, clearly unhappy with the sudden change in his opponent. This match was not requested against you, he said, his voice low and irritated. It is now, I said. He studied me, the way every opponent had studied me since the match against Threxil, weighing rumor against reality, uncertain which one he was about to face. The match began, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, I did not fight to win quickly. Varn was strong, far stronger than Threxil had been, but slower, more reliant on overwhelming force than precise technique. I spent the opening exchange testing his rhythm, deflecting his strikes rather than countering them, letting him spend his energy against a target that refused to give him the satisfaction of an easy finish. Somewhere in the middle of the match, I realized something important. Varn was not fighting to win. He was fighting to prove something, the same way bullies across every species and every world eventually reveal themselves to be fighting not from strength, but from a deep, hidden fear of being seen as weak. I ended the match not with the sharp, decisive lock I had used against Threxil, but with something slower, more deliberate. I let him overextend, guided his momentum safely past me, and pinned him gently to the mat, in a hold that offered no possibility of escape, but also no possibility of injury. Yield, I said quietly. He struggled once, twice, and then, recognizing the position for what it was, stopped. Yield, he said finally, his voice tight with something between anger and disbelief. I released him immediately and stepped back, watching him rise slowly, refusing to meet my eyes. You did not need to win like that, he muttered. You could have finished it faster. I did not want to finish it faster, I said. I wanted you to understand exactly how much control I had over what happened to you the entire time. The same control you have been taking from cadets weaker than yourself. Something in the training hall shifted in that moment. A silence different from the stunned silence after my match with Threxil. This silence carried understanding rather than shock. Griv, watching from the edge of the floor, gave a small, approving nod, the first genuine approval I had seen from him since arriving. Later that evening, Nora found me in the mostly empty mess hall, sitting quietly with a tray of food I had barely touched. You did not need to do that, she said softly, sitting across from me. Yes, I did, I said. Nobody should be forced into a position where following the rules gets them hurt. She was quiet for a moment, turning something over in her thoughts. They already called you Shadowfang, because you were fast, she said finally. I think, after today, they might start calling you that for a different reason. What reason? I asked. Because a shadow does not just move quickly, she said. It also knows exactly where to stand, and when, to keep something worse from reaching the people behind it. I did not have a response to that, not right away. I had spent the past few weeks assuming the name given to me was about speed, about the 3 seconds it had taken to end my first match. It had not occurred to me until that moment that perhaps the name was already beginning to mean something else entirely, something the Academy itself had not yet fully understood. By the following morning, the story of the substituted match had spread just as quickly as the story of my first fight had, but this time, the whispers carried a different weight. Cadets who had once watched me with wary curiosity now watched me with something closer to trust, the kind of trust given cautiously to someone who had proven, twice now, that their strength came paired with restraint rather than recklessness. I still did not fully understand what I had become in the eyes of this academy, but for the first time since stepping off that transport ship weeks earlier, I began to suspect that whatever it was, it might be worth becoming. A month after the match against Threxil, I was summoned again, before the full Concordat Review Council, this time not for a hearing, but for something the summons itself described only as a formal demonstration. I read the message 3 times before I fully understood what it meant. The council overseeing every officer academy across a dozen member worlds wanted to see, in person, whether the reports about the human cadet were accurate. Griv delivered the news to me personally, standing in the doorway of my quarters, with an expression more serious than I had seen from him since the day we met. "This is not a normal review," he said. "Representatives from every Concordat member species will be present, including several who have never once observed a human in combat. What happens in that chamber today will shape how this council writes its assessment of humanity's readiness for advanced officer roles." "That seems like a large decision to hang on one demonstration," I said. "It is," Griv said, "which is exactly why they chose to hang it there. Species readiness has always been judged by strength, by technology, by the size of a fleet, or the reach of an empire. Humanity has none of those advantages yet. What you did against Threxil suggested something this council has never had to measure before, something that cannot be counted in ships or numbers. And if I fail today," I said, "what happens to that assessment?" Griv did not answer right away, and his silence told me more than words could have. The demonstration chamber was larger than any room I had entered since arriving at the academy, built in tiers that rose high above a central floor, filled that afternoon with representatives from species I recognized only from academy briefings, alongside several I had never seen before, beings whose homeworlds existed only as distant points on a star chart I had barely begun to memorize. Overseer Van addressed the gathered council from a raised platform, her voice carrying easily across the silent chamber. "Cadet Solano's recent performance has raised questions this council has debated for weeks," she said. "Questions about how readiness should be measured among species whose strengths do not resemble our own. Rather than continue debating in the abstract, this council has requested a live demonstration against an opponent selected specifically to test the limits of what we observed previously." The far door of the chamber opened, and my opponent stepped through, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, I felt something colder than nerves settle into my chest. It was not a single cadet, it was 3, standing shoulder to shoulder, representing 3 different species, each one known for a different combat specialty. A Kathrani fighter for speed, a Doran warrior for raw strength, and beside them, a smaller, quicker being from a scouting species called the Ithril, known throughout the Concordat for unmatched reflexes and unpredictable movement. "This is not a standard match," Overseer Van said, watching my reaction carefully. "It is a demonstration of adaptability, Cadet. You will face all 3, not simultaneously, but in immediate succession, with no rest between opponents. This council wishes to understand not simply whether you can win a single fight, but whether the skill you demonstrated against Threxil holds under sustained pressure." I looked across the floor at the 3 cadets waiting for me, each one studying me with a different kind of focus, and somewhere behind my nervousness, a strange, steady calm began to settle in, the same calm I had felt in the seconds before my first match, when the noise of the crowd had faded into something distant and unimportant. "I understand," I said. The first opponent, the Kathrani fighter, moved exactly the way Threxil had, relying on speed and confidence, and I ended that exchange the same way I had ended my very first match, reading his commitment and using it against him before he could correct his balance. It took slightly longer this time, nearly 6 seconds instead of 3, my body already carrying the early strain of what I knew would be a longer fight than any I had faced before. The second opponent gave me no such rhythm to read. The Doran warrior fought with pure strength, absorbing strikes that would have ended a lesser exchange immediately, forcing me to rely on footwork and positioning, rather than any single decisive technique. I spent nearly a full minute maneuvering around his reach, tiring him gradually rather than overpowering him directly, until a single opening allowed me to redirect his forward charge into a controlled fall that left him unable to continue. By the time the third opponent stepped forward, my arms had begun to shake from exhaustion, and I understood, with sudden clarity, that this final match would not be decided by technique alone. The ethereal scout moved with a kind of unpredictable quickness unlike anything I had faced before, darting sideways and backward in patterns that refused to settle into any rhythm I could read. For a long, tense stretch of the match, neither of us gained a clear advantage. I missed twice, exhaustion slowing my reactions just enough to let him slip past my guard, and for the first time since the demonstration began, I felt something close to real fear, not of losing, but of failing in front of a room deciding how an entire species would be judged. And then, in the space between one breath and the next, I remembered something my grandmother told me the very first time she pinned me to a training mat as a child, laughing gently at my frustration. Speed only wins if you let it decide the fight for you. Patience decides who actually wins. I stopped chasing his movement. Instead, I let him come to me, absorbing 2 glancing strikes, rather than reaching for openings that were not truly there, waiting for the single moment his own quickness would overextend past the point his balance could recover from. It came less than 10 seconds later, a sideways feint that carried him a fraction too far, and in that fraction, I closed the distance completely, catching his arm and turning his own momentum into the final lock that ended the match. He tapped out. The chamber remained silent for a long moment afterward, the same heavy, uncertain silence that had followed my very first match weeks earlier, except this time, hundreds of representatives from across the Concordat had witnessed it, not through rumor or second-hand reports, but with their own eyes. Overseer Van rose slowly from her seat, studying me across the quiet chamber. 3 opponents, she said, 3 different combat specialties, no rest between them, and you adapted your technique against each one individually, rather than relying on a single strategy. I did what I was trained to do, I said, breathing hard, my arms trembling now that the fight had ended and the adrenaline had begun to fade. What you were trained to do, she repeated quietly, appears to be something this council has never properly measured in any species before. Not strength, not speed alone, something closer to complete adaptability, paired with remarkable patience under pressure. She turned to address the gathered council, her voice carrying clearly across the chamber. This council has spent generations measuring readiness through the lens of our own species' strengths. Today, we have witnessed a demonstration that suggests our measurements have been incomplete. I recommend a full reassessment of how this council evaluates combat readiness among newly admitted species, beginning immediately. A murmur spread through the chamber, not the mocking laughter that had greeted me on my first day, but something entirely different, a mixture of surprise, uncertainty, and, in more than a few faces I could see from the floor, quiet respect. Griv found me afterward, standing near the same viewport where he had warned me weeks earlier that fear was more dangerous than any opponent. This time, his expression carried none of that earlier caution. You understand what happened in there today, he said. I fought 3 matches instead of 1, I said, still catching my breath. You did more than that, he said. You forced an entire council to admit that everything they believed about combat readiness might be incomplete. That is not something most cadets accomplish in their first month, or their first year, or in some cases, their entire career. I looked out at the swirling storms of the gas giant below, the same storms I had stared at the night after my first match, when I had understood, for the first time, that winning a single fight had only created a much larger problem. I understood now that the problem had never truly been the fighting. It had been the assumption, held by nearly everyone in this academy, that a species without natural claws, without natural armor, without natural size, could not possibly measure up to species that had spent millions of years evolving those advantages. What none of them had accounted for was the simple, quiet truth my grandmother had tried to teach me, long before I ever left Earth. Advantages built by nature can make a species comfortable. Advantages built by necessity make a species dangerous in ways comfort never will. By nightfall, word of the demonstration had spread across the entire station, growing into a story that would eventually reach far beyond it, carried by officials and observers back to their homeworlds, retold in briefings and reports across a dozen systems that had never before given serious thought to what humanity might contribute to the wider galaxy. I sat alone that evening in the quiet training hall where, weeks earlier, Threxel had first tested the name Shadowfang on his tongue, uncertain whether it was meant as mockery or warning. I understood now that it no longer mattered which one it had started as. Names given out of fear have a strange way of becoming names earned through respect, once the person wearing them proves, again and again, exactly what they are capable of. My first victory had taken 3 seconds. By nightfall that same day, an entire academy had already begun asking a question that would follow me for the rest of my career among the stars. A question I suspected the wider galaxy itself would spend years trying to answer. If a single, unmodified human cadet could do what I had done on her very first week among them, quietly, without enhancement, without warning, relying on nothing but patience, precision, and a willingness to close the distance others were too cautious to close themselves, then what exactly had the rest of the galaxy been underestimating, for all these years, about the smallest species now standing among them? I did not have an answer yet. But somewhere among the stars, I suspected, humanity was only just beginning to give one.